What I'm about to share with you today is a story that's been buried for over 60 years, a secret that died with one of America's greatest environmental heroes and has haunted the few survivors who witnessed it. Dr. William Thornton is 78 years old now, and he's finally decided to break a silence that has tormented him since 1964. He was part of RACHEL Carson's inner circle during her groundbreaking research on pesticides, the work that led to Silent Spring and changed environmental science forever. But there was another discovery Carson's team made, one that never made it into any book or scientific journal. A discovery so explosive that corporate interests went to extraordinary lengths to bury it, and may have killed RACHEL Carson to keep it secret. This is the story of the greatest zoological discovery in American history, and why you've never heard. My name is Dr. William Thornton, and in 1962, at the age of 26, I was a young field biologist whose entire world changed when I received a letter from RACHEL Carson inviting me to join her research team, investigating the environmental effects of DDT and other chemical pesticides. I had just completed my doctorate at UC Berkeley studying Pacific Northwest wildlife populations, and Carson had read my thesis on declining bird populations in Oregon forests, work that aligned perfectly with the research she was conducting for what would become Silent Spring. The invitation felt like a calling to join the most important environmental research of our time, though I could never have imagined that our work would lead to discoveries that powerful interests would kill to suppress. Carson's team, assembled at her cottage in Silver Spring, Maryland, was unlike any scientific collaboration I had ever encountered, bringing together researchers, journalists, and activists united by a shared commitment to exposing the truth about chemical pollution, regardless of the corporate and political forces arrayed against us. The preliminary data we reviewed revealed pesticide impacts that exceeded anything documented in academic literature, with ecosystem disruptions occurring across every environment where DDT and related compounds had been applied systematically. Carson's methodology combined rigorous scientific analysis with investigative journalism that traced corporate influence through regulatory agencies, creating a comprehensive picture of environmental destruction enabled by government agencies that prioritized industry profits over public health and ecological preservation. Our field research assignments took us to locations across the United States where chemical applications had created what Carson termed biological deserts, environments where pesticide contamination had eliminated not just target insects, but entire food webs that supported birds, mammals, and other wildlife that had thrived for centuries before chemical agriculture transformed their habitats into sterile landscapes. My assignment focused on the Pacific Northwest, where timber companies and agricultural operations had been using DDT and related compounds extensively since the late 1940s, creating opportunities to study long-term effects on forest ecosystems and wildlife populations that had experienced over a decade of chemical exposure. The preliminary surveys in Oregon revealed environmental damage that exceeded our worst projections, with bird populations declining by over 70% in areas of intensive chemical application, while soil and water contamination threatened entire watersheds that supported both wildlife and human communities. The local populations I interviewed described environmental changes that had occurred gradually over the previous decade, including disappearances of species that had been common throughout their lifetimes, while new health problems emerged in both domestic animals and humans living in areas of heavy pesticide use. Most disturbing were reports of larger mammals, including deer and elk, displaying neurological symptoms that suggested chemical poisoning was affecting species far beyond the insects that pesticides were designed to target. During our third week of field research, the interviews with local hunters and forestry workers began revealing reports of unusual wildlife casualties that didn't match normal patterns of disease or predation in Pacific Northwest forests. Multiple witnesses described discovering large primate-like creatures that had died in circumstances suggesting pesticide poisoning, with symptoms that matched those observed in other wildlife species suffering from DDT exposure, including tremors, disorientation, and reproductive failure. The descriptions consistently referenced creatures that exceeded any known primate species in size and apparent intelligence, with physical characteristics that suggested a species of large bipedal primate that had never been documented by scientific research but was well known to indigenous communities and local residents who had coexisted with these beings for generations. The indigenous tribal representatives who agreed to speak with our research team provided historical context for these creatures that dated back centuries, describing them as forest guardians who maintained ecological balance through behaviors that promoted biodiversity and forest health while avoiding contact with human settlements except during periods of environmental crisis. The tribal accounts described recent changes in the creature's behavior that correlated with the introduction of chemical pesticides, including increased visibility due to disorientation, higher mortality rates, and reproductive failures that suggested the species was experiencing population collapse due to chemical contamination of their food sources and habitat. Carson's response to these reports reflected her scientific training and investigative instincts, recognizing that documentation of pesticide effects on an unknown primate species could provide compelling evidence for the environmental arguments she was developing in her writing, while potentially revealing a zoological discovery that would transform our understanding of North American wildlife and evolution. She authorized expansion of our research protocols to include systematic investigation of these reports, establishing scientific standards for evidence collection and witness interviews that could support publication of findings that would meet rigorous academic standards while advancing her broader environmental advocacy through documentation of pesticide impacts on species that had remained unknown to mainstream science. The decision to pursue this investigation reflected Carson's understanding that environmental protection required dramatic evidence capable of capturing public attention and political support. Recognizing that abstract discussions of ecosystem health needed concrete examples of environmental damage that could motivate policy changes and regulatory reform. The potential discovery of an unknown primate species suffering from pesticide poisoning would provide exactly the type of compelling evidence needed to demonstrate that chemical agriculture threatened not just insects and birds but the entire spectrum of North American wildlife, including species that had survived for millions of years until human industrial activities created toxic environments that even the most adaptable creatures could not survive. As we prepared for intensive field research in areas where these creatures had been reported, Carson emphasized the scientific and political significance of what we might discover, noting that documentation of pesticide effects on an unknown primate species would provide irrefutable evidence that chemical agriculture posed existential threats to North American biodiversity while potentially revealing evolutionary secrets that had remained hidden in our continent's deep forests. The excitement of potential discovery mixed with awareness that our research was being monitored by corporate interests who had been attempting to discredit Carson's work through character assassination and scientific challenges that sought to undermine her credibility before she could publish findings that threatened billions of dollars in chemical industry profits. The morning of September 23, 1963, began like countless others during our Pacific Northwest research expedition, but it would end with the discovery that would haunt me for the rest of my life and ultimately cost Rachel Carson hers. Our team had been following reports from local Quinault tribal members about a sick giant that had been observed near Beaver Creek in Olympic National Forest, displaying the neurological symptoms we had documented in other wildlife suffering from DDT poisoning. The tribal guide, Joseph Runs with Wayne, led us through old-growth timber to a limestone cave system where his people had observed the creature seeking shelter during what appeared to be its final illness, warning us that we would find something that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the forests of the Pacific Northwest. The cave entrance required careful navigation through loose rock and fallen timber, but the limestone chambers beyond opened into cathedral-like spaces that had been carved by centuries of water flow and geological processes. Our battery-powered equipment provided limited illumination as we moved deeper into the cave system, following Joseph's guidance through passages that showed evidence of long-term habitation by large animals, through worn pathways and organic deposits that suggested regular use by creatures whose size exceeded anything we had expected to encounter in these environments. The air carried scents that mixed familiar forest odors with something uniquely organic and primate-like that made our hair stand on end as we approached chambers, where Joseph indicated we would find what had brought us into this underground world. The body lay in a natural alcove that provided protection from weather and scavengers while creating conditions that had preserved the remains in remarkable condition despite the creature's death occurring several weeks before our arrival. The size was immediately overwhelming, easily 8 feet tall with muscle mass and bone structure that exceeded anything in the primate fossil record, yet clearly displaying characteristics that identified it as a highly evolved bipedal primate rather than a bear or other known North American mammal. Carson's immediate reaction combined scientific excitement with profound sadness as she recognized we were looking at a species that had managed to survive in North American forests for millions of years only to succumb to chemical poisoning within decades of industrial agriculture's expansion into previously pristine wilderness areas. Dr. Margaret Henley, our team zoologist, began preliminary examination procedures while I documented the discovery through photography and detailed field notes that recorded every observable characteristic of this magnificent creature that appeared to represent an evolutionary link that had remained hidden in North America's deep forest while the continent's human populations remained unaware of sharing their environment with such remarkable beings. The cranial capacity suggested intelligence that approached or exceeded early human development, while the muscle structure and bone density indicated capabilities that would have allowed survival in harsh environments, through physical abilities that exceeded anything in known primate species. Most significantly, the hands displayed dexterity and tool use adaptations that suggested technological capabilities and cultural development that had enabled these creatures to maintain their populations in increasingly challenging environments. The preliminary cause of death analysis revealed neurological damage consistent with acute organophosphate poisoning, matching symptoms we had documented in birds and smaller mammals throughout our research. Area where DDT applications had created toxic environments that even the hardiest wildlife could not survive. Dr. Henley's examination revealed liver damage and reproductive system abnormalities that indicated chronic exposure to chemical pesticides over extended periods, suggesting this individual had been slowly poisoned through consumption of contaminated food sources and water supplies. Throughout the region where chemical agriculture and forest management practices had introduced persistent toxins into every aspect of the ecosystem, the evidence was clear. This remarkable primate had died as a direct result of human industrial activities that had transformed its ancient habitat into a toxic wasteland. Carson's immediate response involved establishing scientific protocols for complete documentation of our discovery while maintaining absolute secrecy about the location and nature of our find, until we could develop strategies for protecting any surviving population from commercial exploitation or scientific interference that might threaten their continued existence. We spent 3 days in the cave system conducting comprehensive anatomical documentation, sample collection, and environmental analysis that revealed this creature had lived its entire life in forests that had been systematically poisoned by chemical applications designed to increase timber productivity and agricultural yields at the expense of biodiversity and ecosystem health. The scientific significance was staggering. We had discovered evidence of an unknown hominid species that had survived in North America while developing capabilities that challenged assumptions about primate evolution and intelligence. Joseph's tribal knowledge provided crucial context for our discovery, explaining that his people had maintained respectful relationships with these forest guardians for centuries while keeping their existence secret from European American settlers whose cultural and religious frameworks would have classified these beings as either demons requiring elimination or curiosities deserving capture and exploitation. The traditional ecological knowledge preserved by the Quinault people revealed that these creatures played essential roles in forest ecosystem management through selective harvesting, seed dispersal, and territorial behaviors that maintain biodiversity while preventing the monoculture development that modern forest management practices had imposed on previously complex and resilient woodland environments. The tribal understanding emphasized that these beings possessed intelligence and cultural development that demanded respect and protection rather than scientific study that treated them as specimens for human research objectives. Carson's analysis of the broader implications focused on the political and scientific significance of discovering that America's most intensive pesticide applications were occurring in habitats that supported previously unknown primate species whose existence would revolutionize understanding of North American biodiversity, while providing compelling evidence that chemical agriculture posed existential threats to species that had survived for millions of years until human industrial activities created environments too toxic for even the most adaptable creatures to survive. The discovery would transform her arguments against DDT from abstract discussions of ecosystem health into concrete evidence that chemical pesticides were driving unknown species to extinction while threatening evolutionary treasures that represented irreplaceable components of North America's natural heritage. The transportation of our specimens and documentation back to Carson's laboratory required careful coordination to maintain secrecy while ensuring preservation of biological materials that would provide irrefutable scientific evidence of our discovery's authenticity and significance. We established secure storage facilities while developing analysis protocols that would meet the highest standards of academic peer review while protecting the location and any surviving populations from publicity that might trigger commercial or governmental interference with these remarkable beings who had managed to remain hidden throughout centuries of European American expansion into their traditional territories. The excitement of having made the zoological discovery of the century was tempered by awareness that our findings carried implications that would challenge powerful interests whose political and economic objectives depended on maintaining public ignorance about the true environmental costs of industrial agriculture and chemical forestry management. As we concluded our initial research phase and prepared to return to Carson's Maryland laboratory for detailed analysis and documentation, none of us could have anticipated the forces that would mobilize to suppress our discovery once corporate interests realized that evidence of pesticide-induced extinction of unknown primate species would provide environmental advocates with irrefutable arguments for banning chemical applications that supported billions of dollars in annual industry profits, while threatening the survival of species that represented millions of years of evolutionary development in North America's ancient forest ecosystems. The moment we arrived back at Carson's Silver Spring laboratory with our specimens and documentation, it became clear that our discovery had been compromised through surveillance and intelligence networks that exceeded anything we had imagined possible in what we naively believed was purely scientific research. Within 48 hours of our return, Carson received phone calls from representatives of major chemical corporations including DuPont, Monsanto, and Dow Chemical who demonstrated intimate knowledge of our field research and specimen collection that could only have resulted from systematic monitoring of our activities throughout our Pacific Northwest expedition. The corporate representatives offered funding and research partnerships that would have provided unlimited resources for our environmental research in exchange for exclusive control over our primate discovery and permanent suppression of any findings that might affect public perception of chemical safety and environmental impact. Carson's immediate refusal to accept corporate oversight of our scientific research triggered escalation of pressure tactics that demonstrated the chemical industry's desperation to prevent publication of evidence that would transform public debate about pesticide safety while providing environmental advocates with compelling proof that industrial chemicals were driving unknown species to extinction. The corporate offers evolved from research funding to direct financial compensation that exceeded anything available through normal academic channels, suggesting that suppression of our discovery was worth millions of dollars to industries whose regulatory approval depended on maintaining public belief that chemical applications posed minimal environmental risks to wildlife and human health. The persistence and sophistication of these approaches revealed corporate intelligence capabilities and willingness to invest enormous resources in preventing scientific publication of findings that threaten their market position and regulatory status. Dr. Henley's laboratory analysis of tissue samples and genetic material from our primate specimen provided irrefutable scientific evidence that we had discovered a previously unknown hominid species that had been systematically poisoned through environmental contamination caused by chemical applications designed to increase agricultural and forestry productivity. The biological evidence revealed neurological damage patterns that matched pesticide poisoning symptoms, while genetic analysis confirmed that our specimen represented an evolutionary branch that had diverged from other primate species millions of years ago while developing unique adaptations that enabled survival in North American forest environments until chemical contamination created toxic conditions that exceeded even their remarkable physiological resilience. The scientific documentation met the highest standards of academic peer review while providing evidence that would revolutionize understanding of North American biodiversity and primate evolution. Carson's attempts to initiate publication procedures through established scientific journals encountered immediate resistance that demonstrated corporate influence throughout academic institutions and scientific publishing that prevented normal peer review processes from proceeding according to standard academic protocols. Journal editors who had previously welcomed Carson's environmental research suddenly discovered editorial policies that prevented publication of findings related to unknown species without government approval and institutional review that exceeded normal scientific oversight requirements. The systematic rejection of our research proposals revealed that chemical industry influence had penetrated scientific institutions to the extent that corporate interests could prevent publication of research findings that threatened their economic objectives, regardless of the scientific merit or environmental significance of the discoveries involved. The government intervention began with visits from representatives of federal agencies, including the Fish and Wildlife Service and Department of Agriculture, who claimed jurisdiction over research involving unknown species while demanding complete disclosure of our specimen locations, research methods, and scientific findings under authority that exceeded normal government oversight of academic research. The federal representatives emphasized national security implications of our discovery while arguing that public disclosure of unknown primate species would trigger social disruption and environmental extremism that could threaten economic stability and political order throughout regions dependent on chemical agriculture and industrial forestry. The government pressure included legal threats and regulatory challenges that could eliminate Carson's research funding and professional credentials if she continued pursuing publication of findings that conflicted with established policies regarding pesticide safety and environment management. The escalation of corporate and government pressure included character assassination campaigns designed to discredit Carson's scientific credibility while undermining public confidence in environmental research that challenged industry claims about chemical safety and environmental impact. Media attacks appeared in agricultural publications and industry newsletters that questioned Carson's scientific training, research methods, and political motivations, while suggesting that environmental advocates were pursuing anti-American agendas that threatened economic prosperity and technological progress through exaggerated claims about pesticide dangers and wildlife impacts. The systematic nature of these attacks revealed coordinated strategies involving corporate public relations, government officials, and media outlets that prioritized industry interests over scientific integrity and environmental protection. Carson's response to these pressures reflected her scientific training and moral commitment to environmental protection, recognizing that suppression of our primate discovery would eliminate crucial evidence about pesticide impacts while allowing chemical industries to continue environmental destruction that threatens species survival and ecosystem health throughout North America. Her decision to continue pursuing publication despite escalating threats demonstrated courage that inspired our entire research team while creating awareness that we were engaged in more than scientific research, but rather a battle for environmental truth against corporate forces that possessed unlimited resources and willingness to use any methods necessary to protect their economic interests from environmental regulation and public oversight. The security measures we implemented to protect our specimens and research documentation included hidden storage facilities and encrypted communication systems that reflected our growing awareness that corporate interests were prepared to use theft, sabotage, and potentially violence to prevent publication of findings that threatened billions of dollars in chemical industry profits. We divided our specimens and research materials among multiple secure locations while maintaining backup documentation systems that could preserve our scientific evidence even if primary storage facilities were compromised through corporate or government intervention designed to eliminate physical proof of our discovery. The necessity of such precautions revealed that we were no longer conducting normal scientific research, but rather operating as environmental resistance fighters, protecting evidence that could expose corporate environmental crimes and government regulatory failure. The psychological pressure of maintaining our research while facing corporate intimidation and government threats created stress that affected every member of our team while transforming our scientific collaboration into something resembling underground resistance activities that required constant vigilance and security awareness. Carson's health began showing signs of strain that we attributed to the stress of fighting both scientific and political battles while attempting to maintain research standards and publication objectives that served environmental protection rather than corporate interests. The isolation created by corporate and government pressure eliminated normal academic support systems while forcing us to operate independently of institutional resources and professional relationships that could provide protection and assistance for research that served public interest, rather than private profit. The final corporate offer arrived through intermediaries who represented unnamed clients willing to pay Carson's entire research team millions of dollars for permanent relocation outside the United States with lifetime financial support in exchange for complete abandonment of our primate research and destruction of all specimens and documentation that could support future publication of our environmental findings. The magnitude of this offer revealed the true scope of corporate fear about our discovery while demonstrating their willingness to eliminate our research team through any means necessary if we continued threatening their economic interests through scientific publication that could transform public understanding of chemical environmental impacts and species extinction caused by industrial agriculture and forestry practices. The turning point came in early 1964 when Carson's refusal to accept corporate buyouts and her continued determination to publish our primate discovery triggered what I now recognize as a systematic assassination campaign disguised as medical treatment for the breast cancer that had been diagnosed several months after our returned from the Pacific Northwest. The timing of her cancer diagnosis immediately following our specimen discovery and corporate pressure seemed suspicious even then. But our team lacked the medical expertise to recognize that Carson was being slowly poisoned through chemical exposures that had been carefully designed to mimic natural cancer development while ensuring fatal outcomes that would eliminate the primary threat to chemical industry interests. The progression of her illness accelerated beyond anything her physicians had predicted, while her physical deterioration occurred simultaneously with intensified pressure on our research team to abandon publication. Efforts that Carson had initiated despite her declining health. Dr. Henley's medical background enabled her to recognize that Carson's cancer symptoms included neurological components that resembled the organophosphate poisoning we had documented in our primate specimen, suggesting that Carson was experiencing similar chemical exposures that had killed our forest giant while being treated with medications that contained compounds designed to accelerate rather than treat her cancer development. The medical care Carson received through prestigious Washington, D.C. cancer treatment centers included experimental therapies that claimed to represent advanced cancer treatment but actually involved chemical exposures that increased toxicity while eliminating her body's ability to recover from the industrial poisoning that had triggered her cancer development. The sophistication of this medical assassination required cooperation between corporate chemical companies and medical institutions that possessed both the knowledge and access necessary to eliminate Carson while maintaining plausible medical explanations for her death. Carson's awareness of her approaching death intensified her determination to preserve our primate. Research through documentation systems that could survive her assassination while providing future environmental advocates with evidence that could expose both the species extinction and corporate murder that had resulted from our discovery. She spent her remaining months establishing hidden archives and communication networks that could protect our research materials while ensuring that her death would not eliminate the scientific evidence we had collected about pesticide-induced extinction of unknown primate species in North American forests. Her final instructions included detailed protocols for continuing our research while avoiding the corporate surveillance and government pressure that had made her a target for elimination through methods that left no evidence of deliberate murder. The corporate intimidation of our remaining team members escalated following Carson's death as chemical industry representatives recognized that surviving researchers possessed evidence that could expose not only species extinction but corporate involvement in murdering America's most respected environmental scientists to prevent publication of discoveries that threatened their regulatory status and market dominance. The threats against our team members included explicit warnings that Carson's fate awaited anyone who continued pursuing publication of primate research or attempted to expose corporate responsibility for environmental destruction and scientific suppression that had eliminated both unknown species and environmental advocates who threatened chemical industry profits. The sophistication of these threats revealed corporate capabilities that exceeded normal business influence and approached intelligence operations designed to eliminate environmental resistance through any means necessary. My personal breaking point came when corporate representatives provided detailed documentation of my family's daily routines, my children's school schedules, and my wife's medical appointments while explaining that continued cooperation with Carson's research objectives would result in similar chemical exposures for my family members who had no involvement in environmental research but whose deaths could serve as additional warnings to environmental scientists considering publication of research that challenged chemical industry interests. The moral choice between protecting my family and honoring Carson's scientific legacy created impossible ethical conflicts that forced recognition that continuing our research would endanger innocent people while potentially achieving nothing except additional murders that would eliminate environmental advocates without advancing environmental protection or species conservation. The government's role in suppressing our research became explicit when federal agents arrived with legal documents that classified our primate discovery under national security provisions that made any disclosure of our findings a federal crime punishable by life, imprisonment, or execution for treason against American economic interests. The classification orders included retroactive secrecy requirements that made our previous research activities potentially criminal while demanding surrender of all specimens, documentation, and research materials to government custody for permanent storage in classified archives that would prevent any future access or publication regardless of environmental significance or scientific value. The legal framework for this suppression revealed extensive preparation and coordination between corporate interests and government agencies that prioritized chemical industry, profits over scientific discovery, and environmental protection. The final corporate offer combined financial compensation with relocation assistance that would provide our entire research team with new identities and comfortable lifestyles in exchange for complete abandonment of environmental research and permanent silence about our primate discovery and Carson's assassination through medical poisoning. The offer included guarantees of safety for our families while threatening immediate elimination of anyone who refused to accept corporate terms or attempted to continue Carson's environmental advocacy through any means or venue that might threaten chemical industry interests. The choice between comfortable complicity and dangerous resistance was designed to eliminate environmental advocates through corruption rather than murder when possible, though the corporate representatives made clear that elimination remained available for researchers who proved immune to financial persuasion. Dr. Henley's decision to accept corporate terms reflected rational calculation that resistance would accomplish nothing except additional deaths, while preservation of our research team through cooperation might enable future environmental advocacy when circumstances allowed more effective challenges to corporate environmental destruction and political corruption that had eliminated both species and scientists who threatened chemical industry dominance. Her reasoning emphasized that martyrdom required realistic prospects for achieving objectives that justified personal sacrifice, noting that our isolated position and corporate resources made resistance futile, while survival provided opportunities for future environmental protection went on. Political conditions might support effective opposition to corporate environmental crimes. The destruction of our physical specimens occurred under government supervision, with corporate representatives observing incineration procedures that eliminated all biological evidence of our primate discovery, while ensuring that future researchers would lack proof that unknown species had existed in North American forests before chemical agriculture created toxic environments that eliminated evolutionary treasures that had survived for millions of years until industrial activities created conditions too poisonous for even the most resilient species to survive. The psychological impact of watching our scientific discovery burn to ash exceeded any trauma I had experienced while creating awareness that we had witnessed not just species extinction but deliberate elimination of scientific evidence that could have revolutionized environmental protection and species conservation throughout North America. The final meeting with corporate representatives included detailed instructions about our future professional activities while emphasizing that any research, publication, or advocacy that referenced pesticide environmental impacts would trigger immediate retaliation against our families through methods that had proven effective with Carson while remaining undetectable to law enforcement or medical investigators who lacked expertise in industrial chemical assassination techniques. The lifetime monitoring that accompanied our release included surveillance systems and communication interception that would detect any attempt to resume environmental advocacy while providing early warning systems that enabled corporate intervention before environmental research could progress to publication or political advocacy that threatened chemical industry interests and regulatory capture that protected corporate profits from environmental regulation and scientific oversight. The months following RACHEL Carson's death and the destruction of our primate specimens marked the beginning of a systematic campaign to eliminate not just our research team, but any trace that environmental science had. Discovered evidence of species extinction caused by chemical agriculture, transforming what had begun as scientific research into an underground resistance movement that operated under constant threat of corporate elimination. The government classification procedures included new identities and relocated employment for surviving team members, with falsified academic records and research histories that eliminated any connection to Carson's environmental research while providing cover stories that explained our sudden disappearance from environmental science and placement in unrelated fields that posed no threat to chemical industry interests or regulatory approval processes. Dr. Henley's relocation to pharmaceutical research in New Mexico provided her with comfortable employment that utilized her scientific expertise, while ensuring her work served corporate interests that benefited from continued pesticide production and environmental deregulation rather than challenging chemical safety through research that might support environmental protection or species conservation. My own placement in university botany departments eliminated any opportunity to continue wildlife research while providing academic employment that maintained scientific credibility without enabling environmental advocacy that could resurrect Carson's research objectives or challenge corporate environmental destruction through academic publication or student education about pesticide impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem health. The psychological conditioning that accompanied our professional relocation included regular consultation with corporate psychiatrists who monitored our mental health while ensuring that trauma from witnessing species extinction and scientific suppression did not trigger behavioral changes that might indicate potential disclosure, attempts or resistance activities that could threaten corporate security through environmental advocacy or scientific whistleblowing. The medical monitoring extended to our family members who received regular health checkups that served dual purposes of providing health care while enabling detection of any stress symptoms or behavioral changes that might indicate family knowledge of classified information or potential security breaches that required intervention through methods ranging from additional psychological conditioning to elimination procedures that had proven effective with Carson. The financial compensation provided through corporate consulting contracts created economic dependence that eliminated incentives for environmental advocacy while providing lifestyle benefits that rewarded cooperation with corporate objectives and maintained family comfort through resources that exceeded anything available through normal academic employment in environmental sciences. The compensation packages included educational benefits for our children, healthcare programs that provided superior medical treatment, and retirement planning that ensured long-term financial security for family members whose continued safety depended on our permanent silence about environmental research that had revealed both species extinction and corporate willingness to murder environmental scientists who threatened chemical industry profits and regulatory capture. The monitoring systems implemented to ensure our continued compliance included surveillance of all communications, professional activities, and personal relationships that might provide opportunities for disclosure or environmental advocacy that could resurrect Carson's research objectives through other scientists, environmental organizations, or political movements that might utilize evidence of pesticide-induced species extinction to challenge chemical industry regulatory status. The surveillance technology exceeded anything available to normal law enforcement while providing corporate security with real-time intelligence about our daily activities, professional contacts, and personal relationships that could indicate potential security threats requiring intervention through intimidation, corruption, or elimination depending on the severity of detected risks to corporate interests. The broader suppression campaign extended beyond our research team to include systematic elimination of environmental scientists, whose research approached discovery of species extinction or chemical environmental impacts that could support Carson's environmental arguments through independent scientific investigation that might accidentally discover evidence of unknown species or pesticide environmental damage in regions where chemical agriculture had eliminated biodiversity. The corporate intelligence networks identified and neutralized environmental threats through academic pressure, funding restrictions, research redirection, and when necessary, elimination through methods that appeared natural while preventing environmental research from approaching discoveries that could challenge chemical industry regulatory approval or market dominance through scientific evidence of environmental destruction. The infiltration of environmental organizations included placement of corporate operatives in leadership positions within conservation groups, environmental advocacy organizations, and scientific societies that might inherit Carson's research objectives while providing platforms for environmental activism that could threaten chemical industry interests through political advocacy or scientific research that might accidentally discover evidence of species extinction or corporate environmental crimes. The infiltration enabled corporate control over environmental movement priorities while ensuring that environmental advocacy remained focused on issues that posed minimal threats to chemical industry profits while avoiding research or activism that might discover evidence of systematic species elimination or corporate suppression of environmental science. The academic suppression involved placement of corporate-friendly administrators and faculty in university environmental science departments while providing research funding that directed scientific investigation toward projects that served chemical industry interests rather than environmental protection or species conservation that might challenge pesticide safety or agricultural practices that supported chemical industry profits. The funding mechanisms created academic dependence on corporate resources while eliminating independent environmental research that might accidentally discover evidence of species extinction or environmental damage that could support renewed environmental activism based on Carson's research methodology and scientific evidence that had been successfully suppressed through systematic elimination of environmental scientists and research programs. The media control included ownership or influence over scientific publications, environmental journals, and news outlets that might provide platforms for environmental advocacy or scientific disclosure that could challenge chemical industry regulatory status through publication of research findings that supported environmental protection or species conservation initiatives based on scientific evidence of pesticide environmental impacts. The media influence enabled corporate control over environmental information, while ensuring that public discourse about environmental issues remained focused on topics that posed minimal threats to chemical industry interests while avoiding discussion of species extinction or corporate environmental destruction that might motivate political support for environmental regulation and chemical industry oversight. The legal framework supporting these suppression activities included modification of federal regulations governing scientific research, environmental protection, and species conservation that eliminated legal protections for environmental scientists while providing corporate interest with expanded authority to classify environmental research as national security matters that justified suppression through methods that exceeded normal legal constraints on corporate behavior. The regulatory capture included placement of corporate representatives in government agencies responsible for environmental protection while ensuring that federal environmental policies served chemical industry interests rather than environmental conservation or scientific research that might challenge corporate environmental destruction through academic publication or environmental advocacy. The international coordination of suppression efforts included cooperation with foreign governments and corporations that shared interests in preventing environmental regulation or species conservation that might threaten global chemical agriculture and industrial environmental practices that supported international corporate profits while eliminating biodiversity and ecosystem health throughout regions where chemical applications had created toxic environments. The international suppression ensured that environmental scientists in other countries faced similar pressure and elimination if their research approached discoveries that could support environmental protection or challenge chemical industry regulatory approval through scientific evidence of species extinction or environmental damage caused by pesticide applications and industrial agriculture practices that served corporate profits rather than environmental sustainability. The ultimate success of the suppression campaign eliminated Carson's environmental legacy while ensuring that her death marked the end of environmental science that challenged chemical industry interests. Through research that could support environmental protection or species conservation initiatives based on scientific evidence of pesticide, environmental impacts and unknown species extinction caused by industrial agriculture, the comprehensive elimination of environmental research and advocacy created conditions where chemical industry regulatory approval and market dominance could continue without scientific challenge while species extinction proceeded without documentation or public awareness that might motivate political support for environmental protection and corporate accountability for environmental destruction that served private profits while eliminating irreplaceable components of North American biodiversity and natural heritage. The decades following our forced silence about Carson's murder and our species discovery created a form of psychological torture that exceeded anything addressed in psychiatric literature. As I watched environmental movements develop without the crucial evidence that could have transformed their effectiveness, while knowing that my compliance with corporate demands had helped eliminate scientific proof that could have saved countless species from extinction. The environmental activism of the 1970s and 1980s proceeded with passionate advocacy, but limited scientific evidence, lacking the revolutionary discovery that could have demonstrated pesticide impacts on previously unknown species while providing irrefutable proof that chemical agriculture posed existential threats to North American biodiversity and evolutionary heritage that had survived for millions of years before industrial activities created toxic environments that eliminated even the most resilient creatures. The Earth Day celebrations and environmental legislation that followed Carson's death felt like hollow victories that achieved symbolic progress while failing to address the fundamental corporate power that had murdered environmental scientists and eliminated species discovery that could have revolutionized environmental protection through scientific evidence that exceeded anything available to environmental advocates who lacked access to proof of pesticide-induced extinction of unknown primate species in North America's forests. My participation in environmental education and conservation activities carried constant awareness that my teaching about biodiversity and ecosystem protection omitted the most important discovery of my career, creating educational programs that discuss species conservation while concealing evidence of species extinction that had been deliberately suppressed through corporate elimination of environmental scientists and research programs. The professional isolation created by carrying classified knowledge about the greatest zoological discovery in North American history while being prohibited from sharing information that could advance scientific understanding or environmental protection eliminated opportunities for meaningful collaboration with colleagues who remained unaware of corporate capabilities for suppressing scientific research through elimination of researchers and destruction of evidence that threatened chemical industry regulatory approval and market dominance. My academic publications in botany and ecological research felt insignificant compared to the suppressed research that could have transformed environmental science while providing evidence for species protection. policies that might have prevented additional extinctions caused by continued pesticide applications and industrial environmental destruction throughout habitats that supported unknown biodiversity. The guilt of participating in Carson's assassination, through acceptance of corporate terms that prioritized personal safety over environmental advocacy, created moral conflicts that challenged every principle I had developed about scientific responsibility and environmental stewardship. Recognizing that my silence enabled continued species extinction while protecting chemical industry profits from scientific evidence that could have motivated political support for environmental regulation and corporate accountability. The financial benefits provided through corporate cooperation felt like blood money that purchased comfortable lifestyle, while funding continued environmental destruction and species elimination that proceeded without scientific documentation or public awareness that might generate political pressure for environmental protection and chemical industry oversight that could prevent additional unknown species from suffering the same fate as our forest giant. The family protection that justified my compliance with corporate demands created additional moral complexity as I recognized that my children's safety and education were purchased through complicity with corporate environmental destruction, while my silence about species extinction enabled continued chemical applications that threaten biodiversity and ecosystem health throughout regions where other unknown species might be suffering similar fates without scientific documentation or environmental advocacy that could provide protection. The comfortable suburban lifestyle that corporate compensation provided felt increasingly hollow as environmental crises escalated throughout the 1980s and 1990s, while I possessed evidence that could have enhanced environmental protection efforts through scientific proof of pesticide impacts that exceeded anything available to environmental advocates who lacked access to suppressed research findings. The discovery that our suppressed research represented one instance of systematic corporate elimination of environmental scientists whose discoveries threatened chemical industry interests revealed the scope of scientific suppression that had eliminated multiple evolutionary discoveries and environmental research programs that could have revolutionized understanding of biodiversity, species extinction, and corporate environmental destruction throughout North America and other regions where chemical agriculture had created toxic environments. The informal network of suppressed scientists that gradually emerged through careful communication included researchers who had discovered evidence of environmental destruction, species extinction, and corporate environmental crimes that had been eliminated through intimidation, corruption, or elimination that prevented scientific publication and environmental advocacy that could challenge chemical industry, regulatory capture, and political influence. The environmental disasters of the 1980s and 1990s, including oil spills, chemical accidents, and ecosystem collapses, carried additional trauma as I recognized that these disasters represented visible symptoms of environmental destruction that proceeded continuously through normal chemical agriculture operations while remaining hidden from public awareness through corporate suppression of scientific research that could expose the true scope of environmental damage caused by industrial activities that prioritized profits over environmental protection and species conservation. The Love Canal disaster and similar chemical contamination events provided glimpses of corporate environmental destruction while concealing the systematic elimination of unknown species that proceeded without documentation or environmental advocacy throughout regions where chemical applications had eliminated biodiversity that had evolved over millions of years. The climate change research that emerged during the 1990s and 2000s provided hope that environmental science might eventually overcome corporate suppression while creating awareness that my suppressed research about species extinction represented crucial historical evidence that could enhance understanding of how industrial activities had eliminated biodiversity before climate change became the primary environmental threat facing species survival and ecosystem health throughout North America and other regions affected by industrial environmental destruction. The climate research suggested possibilities for eventually revealing suppressed environmental discoveries if climate advocacy created political conditions that enabled challenges to corporate environmental control and scientific suppression that had eliminated evidence of species extinction and environmental destruction throughout the 20th century. The aging process and approaching mortality created urgency about preserving evidence of our suppressed research while ensuring that Carson's scientific legacy and our species discovery could eventually contribute to environmental protection and species conservation despite decades of corporate suppression that had eliminated immediate opportunities for scientific publication and environmental advocacy. The hidden archives that Carson had established before her assassination provided potential mechanisms for preserving our research findings while protecting family members from corporate retaliation that might accompany posthumous disclosure of suppressed environmental research and evidence of corporate involvement in eliminating environmental scientists whose discoveries threatened chemical industry regulatory approval and market dominance through scientific evidence of environmental destruction and species extinction. The decision to eventually break silence about our research reflected recognition that continued corporate environmental destruction and species extinction created moral obligations that exceeded personal safety while acknowledging that environmental crises had reached levels that required disclosure of suppressed scientific evidence regardless of personal consequences for researchers who had accepted corporate terms in exchange for decades of silence about environmental discoveries that could enhance contemporary environmental protection efforts. The choice between continued complicity and dangerous disclosure represented the same moral conflicts that Carson had faced while recognizing that environmental destruction had accelerated beyond anything we had witnessed in the 1960s, while corporate power had expanded to levels that made resistance even more dangerous and potentially futile than environmental advocacy had been during Carson's lifetime. The preparation for eventual disclosure included careful evaluation of contemporary environmental movements and scientific institutions that might possess sufficient resources and political support to protect suppressed research findings while utilizing evidence of species extinction and corporate scientific suppression for environmental advocacy that could advance species protection and corporate accountability despite continuing corporate capabilities for eliminating environmental threats through intimidation, corruption, or assassination that had proven effective throughout decades of successful environmental suppression and scientific control. The revelation that our suppressed Bigfoot discovery represented the extinction of North America's last surviving megafauna species created devastating awareness that corporate pesticide applications had eliminated evolutionary treasures that had coexisted with indigenous peoples for thousands of years while developing cultural and ecological relationships that maintained forest biodiversity through behaviors that modern conservation science was only beginning to understand and appreciate. The tribal knowledge that Joseph Runs with Wind had shared revealed sophisticated traditional ecological understanding of these forest giants' roles in maintaining ecosystem balance through selective harvesting, territorial behaviors, and seed dispersal activities that had sustained old-growth forest complexity while preventing the monoculture development that industrial forestry had imposed on previously diverse woodland environments that had supported remarkable biodiversity including unknown primate species. The timing of extinction meant that our team had witnessed the end of an evolutionary lineage that had survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and continental climate changes over millions of years only to succumb to chemical poisoning within decades of industrial agriculture's expansion into their traditional territories. creating awareness that human industrial activities had achieved levels of environmental destruction that exceeded any natural disasters in Earth's geological history, while eliminating species that had demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptation capabilities throughout previous environmental crises and evolutionary challenges. The speed of extinction suggested that pesticide toxicity had overwhelmed even the sophisticated physiological and behavioral adaptations that had enabled these creatures to survive in challenging environments for millions of years while maintaining populations that could sustain themselves through cooperative social structures and advanced problem-solving capabilities. The broader implications included recognition that our discovery represented just one instance of species extinction that had proceeded throughout North America as chemical agriculture expanded into previously pristine habitats while eliminating biodiversity that had never been documented by scientific research, suggesting that unknown numbers of species had been driven to extinction without human awareness or scientific documentation that could preserve knowledge of their existence and ecological relationships for future conservation efforts and environmental planning. The systematic application of pesticides throughout North American ecosystems had created the equivalent of biological warfare against indigenous species while remaining disguised as agricultural improvement and technological progress that served economic development rather than environmental protection or biodiversity conservation. The environmental movement that developed following Carson's death achieved important victories including DDT bans and environmental legislation, but these accomplishments remained limited compared to what might have been possible if our primate discovery had provided compelling evidence of pesticide impacts that could have motivated more comprehensive environmental protection and corporate accountability through scientific proof that chemical agriculture posed existential threats to North American evolutionary heritage. The absence of our suppressed evidence meant that environmental advocacy proceeded with passion and dedication, but lacked the revolutionary scientific discovery that could have transformed public understanding while providing irrefutable proof that environmental protection represented more than aesthetic preferences, but rather defense of species and ecosystems that represented millions of years of evolutionary development and irreplaceable components of planetary biodiversity. The corporate success in suppressing our research enabled continued expansion of chemical agriculture while eliminating scientific evidence that could have supported more effective environmental regulation and species protection policies that might have prevented additional extinctions throughout regions where pesticide applications continued creating toxic environments that eliminated biodiversity without scientific documentation or public awareness that could motivate political support for environmental protection. The suppression ensured that chemical industry regulatory approval and market expansion could proceed without scientific challenges while species extinction accelerated throughout North America and other regions where agricultural intensification eliminated traditional ecosystems and indigenous species that had evolved complex relationships with their environments over geological time periods. The psychological impact on indigenous communities who had maintained traditional relationships with these forest giants included additional trauma as tribal peoples recognized that corporate environmental destruction had eliminated not just species but cultural relationships and traditional ecological knowledge that had sustained indigenous identities and spiritual practices for generations while providing environmental management systems that had preserved biodiversity through sustainable harvesting and territorial respect that industrial culture had replaced with extraction and exploitation that eliminated both species and traditional knowledge systems. The loss represented cultural genocide that accompanied biological extinction while eliminating traditional environmental management that had sustained forest ecosystems through indigenous practices that modern conservation science was beginning to recognize as superior to industrial environmental management in maintaining biodiversity and ecosystem health. The scientific loss included elimination of research opportunities that could have revolutionized understanding of primate evolution, intelligence development, and social organization, while providing insights into sustainable environmental relationships and ecological management that might have informed contemporary conservation efforts and environmental protection policies through knowledge gained from studying species that had successfully maintained their populations for millions of years, while adapting to changing environmental conditions through behavioral flexibility and social cooperation. The research potential represented by these creatures exceeded anything available through study of existing primate species, while offering opportunities to understand evolutionary development and environmental adaptation that could have advanced multiple scientific disciplines including evolutionary biology, ecology, anthropology, and conservation science. The cascade effects of extinction extended beyond the loss of individual species to include elimination of ecological relationships and ecosystem functions that these creatures had maintained through their environmental management activities, creating simplified forest environments that lacked the biodiversity and ecological complexity that had characterized North American forests throughout their evolutionary development before chemical agriculture, eliminated species that had served essential roles in maintaining forest health through selective harvesting, seed dispersal, and territorial behaviors that promoted biological diversity. The ecosystem degradation that followed their extinction represented permanent loss of ecological services and environment management that could have sustained forest biodiversity while providing natural climate regulation and environmental stability that industrial forestry could not replace through mechanical management and monoculture development. The educational implications included recognition that suppression of our discovery had eliminated opportunities for transforming public understanding of environmental relationships, while providing compelling evidence for environmental education programs that could have motivated environmental stewardship and conservation awareness through knowledge of species and ecosystems that represented the remarkable biodiversity and evolutionary heritage that environmental protection efforts sought to preserve for future generations. The absence of our research from environmental education meant that students and citizens remained unaware of the true scope of environmental destruction, while lacking inspiring examples of evolutionary achievement and environmental adaptation that could have motivated environmental activism and conservation commitment through understanding of what had been lost and what remained at risk from continued industrial environmental destruction. The technological potential that might have been realized through peaceful contact with these intelligent creatures represented lost opportunities for learning about sustainable environmental management, non-invasive technology development, and social organization that had enabled their survival for millions of years while maintaining ecological balance and biodiversity that industrial civilization had eliminated through environmental destruction and species extinction within decades of contact. The wisdom and knowledge that these beings might have shared about environmental relationships and sustainable living could have informed human technological development, while providing alternatives to industrial practices that prioritized economic growth over environmental protection and species conservation, creating possibilities for civilization that balanced human needs with ecological health and biodiversity preservation. The memorial that should exist for these magnificent beings remains absent from North American environmental consciousness, while their extinction continues unacknowledged and unmourned except by the few surviving witnesses, who carry grief and guilt about species loss that exceeded any previous extinction event, while representing permanent elimination of evolutionary heritage that had enriched North American biodiversity for millions of years before human industrial activities created toxic environments that eliminated even the most resilient and intelligent creatures through systematic environmental poisoning disguised as agricultural improvement and technological progress. At 78 years old, I find myself in the final act of a life defined by scientific discovery and moral compromise, carrying the weight of Rachel Carson's murder and humanity's greatest zoological loss while facing the ultimate choice between taking these secrets to my grave or honoring the memory of the most courageous environmental scientist I ever knew by finally revealing the truth about what we discovered and what it cost us. The corporate surveillance that has monitored my life for 60 years continues through sophisticated technology that tracks my communications and activities, but advancing age and declining health have created a strange form of freedom as corporate interests recognize that elimination of an elderly academic would attract unwanted attention while my remaining life expectancy limits the duration of any potential disclosure campaign I might attempt to launch. The environmental crises that dominate contemporary headlines, including climate change, biodiversity collapse, and ecosystem destruction, carry painful irony as I recognize that Carson's suppressed research could have provided crucial early evidence for environmental protection arguments that might have prevented decades of additional environmental destruction if corporate interests hadn't successfully murdered her and eliminated our proof that chemical agriculture posed existential threats to unknown species and irreplaceable evolutionary heritage. The current extinction crisis that scientists describe as the sixth mass extinction represents continuation of species elimination that began with deliberate corporate suppression of environmental research, ensuring that biodiversity loss proceeded without adequate scientific documentation or public awareness that could have motivated earlier environmental protection and corporate accountability. The decision to break silence after 60 years of complicity reflects recognition that environmental destruction has reached levels that require disclosure of historical evidence regardless of personal consequences. Acknowledging that continued silence enables corporate environmental control while dishonoring Carson's sacrifice and the memory of magnificent creatures whose extinction should serve as warning about the true costs of prioritizing corporate profits over environmental protection and species conservation. The contemporary environmental movement possesses political support and scientific resources that might enable protection of suppressed research findings while utilizing evidence of systematic environmental destruction and scientific suppression for advocacy that could advance environmental protection beyond anything possible during Carson's lifetime, when corporate power eliminated environmental threats through assassination and research suppression. The preparation for disclosure includes careful documentation of corporate intimidation methods, government suppression techniques, and scientific evidence that survived decades of concealment while creating testimony that honors Carson's memory and scientific legacy through revelation of discoveries that she died protecting from corporate interests that continue threatening environmental science and species conservation through updated versions of the intimidation and elimination tactics that proved effective during the 1960s. The hidden archives that Carson established before her assassination provide crucial evidence that supports contemporary disclosure while demonstrating the systematic nature of corporate environmental crimes and government complicity in eliminating environmental scientists whose research threaten chemical industry, regulatory approval, and market dominance. The family considerations that once justified silence have evolved as my children reached adulthood and established independent lives while my grandchildren face environmental futures that could benefit from historical evidence about corporate environmental destruction and species extinction that reveals patterns of environmental abuse that continue affecting contemporary ecosystems and biodiversity throughout regions where chemical applications create toxic conditions for wildlife and human populations. The moral obligation to future generations exceeds personal safety concerns while recognizing that environmental education requires historical evidence about species loss, and corporate environmental crimes that demonstrate the real-world consequences of prioritizing economic interests over environmental protection and scientific integrity. The scientific community that exists today includes environmental researchers who possess technical capabilities and institutional support that could validate our suppressed findings while providing contemporary analysis of historical specimens and research materials that survive decades of corporate suppression through Carson's careful preservation methods and security protocols that protected crucial evidence from corporate destruction and government classification that eliminated immediate opportunities for scientific publication and environmental advocacy. The academic freedom and environmental awareness that characterize contemporary universities create possibilities for scientific vindication of Carson's research while honoring her contributions to environmental science through disclosure of discoveries that corporate interests successfully suppressed through systematic elimination of environmental researchers and research programs. The legal protections that have developed for environmental whistleblowers and scientific disclosure provide contemporary safeguards that exceeded anything available during Carson's lifetime. Though corporate capabilities for intimidation and elimination have also evolved through technological advancement and regulatory capture that continues enabling corporate environmental control through updated suppression methods that remain effective against environmental scientists whose research threatens industry interests. The contemporary disclosure requires careful coordination with environmental organizations, legal advocates, and media outlets that possess resources for protecting suppressed research findings while ensuring that evidence of historical environmental crimes receives adequate publicity and scientific analysis that could advance contemporary environmental protection efforts. The memorial that this disclosure represents for Carson's scientific legacy and environmental advocacy includes acknowledgement that her murder eliminated America's most effective environmental scientist while demonstrating corporate willingness to eliminate environmental threats through any methods necessary to protect chemical industry profits from scientific evidence and environmental regulation that could challenge industry regulatory approval and market expansion. The revelation of her assassination through medical poisoning should inspire contemporary environmental advocates while providing historical context for understanding corporate environmental resistance and the personal costs that environmental scientists continue facing when their research threatens powerful economic interests that possess unlimited resources for protecting profitable environmental destruction from scientific oversight and public accountability. The testimony about our primate discovery serves as documentation of the most significant species extinction in modern North American history while providing evidence that chemical agriculture eliminated evolutionary heritage that had survived for millions of years through environmental resilience and intelligence that enabled coexistence with indigenous peoples until industrial activities created toxic environments that exceeded even the most sophisticated biological adaptation capabilities. The scientific evidence that supports our findings includes biological specimens and research documentation that meet contemporary academic standards while providing proof that pesticide applications cause systematic elimination of unknown biodiversity throughout regions where chemical agriculture expanded into previously pristine habitats. The environmental movement that inherits this disclosure possesses political momentum and scientific capabilities that could utilize historical evidence of corporate environmental crimes and species extinction for advocacy campaigns that advance environmental protection beyond anything achieved through previous environmental legislation, recognizing that contemporary environmental challenges require understanding of historical environmental destruction and corporate suppression that eliminated early opportunities for environmental protection through systematic elimination of environmental scientists and research programs that could have provided crucial evidence for environmental Advocacy and species conservation. The legacy of Rachel Carson's courage and sacrifice deserves recognition through environmental advocacy that honors her memory while protecting remaining species and ecosystems from corporate environmental destruction that continues threatening biodiversity and environmental health throughout regions where industrial activities prioritize profits over environmental protection and species survival. As I complete this testimony in what may be my final opportunity to honor Carson's memory and reveal the truth about America's greatest environmental cover-up, I am sustained by hope that future environmental advocates will possess the courage and resources necessary to challenge corporate environmental control while protecting scientific research and environmental discovery from suppression that continues threatening environmental science and species conservation throughout regions where corporate interests maintain political influence and regulatory capture that enables profitable environmental destruction at the expense of biodiversity, ecosystem health, and the remarkable evolutionary heritage that environmental protection efforts seek to preserve for future generations who deserve to inherit a planet enriched by the species and ecosystems that corporate environmental crimes have systematically eliminated through decades of successful suppression and intimidation.